how to use traditional radio to build your mortgage business. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the biggest mistake people make when they try to adopt radio. I actually made this mistake myself. I'm going to talk about how to use radio as a backstage pass, and I'm going to talk about how traditional radio can be the tip of a very large and powerful marketing strategy and how I would do it. And I'm going to do my best to do this in 12 minutes. Today's episode actually came about because I had a mortgage broker message me, a guy named Nav, and said, hey, can you do a show on traditional radio? I think that my market listens to radio and I'd like to know how you do it. And I said, yes, I can. In fact, I started in radio even before I started podcasting. So I'm going to break down for you, tell you the story of what happened and the lessons that I learned, and then how you can apply it if you want to do it for your market. And hopefully you find this useful. Hey, my name is Scott Peckford. This is the I Love Mortgage Brokering podcast. This is my weekly 10 to 12 minute podcast where I share with you tactical advice you can use to grow your mortgage business. Before we jump into this episode, I want to give a shout out to our title sponsor, Finmo. Finmo is a Canadian mortgage application, document collection, submission platform designed specifically for Canadian borrowers. It's very easy for borrowers to use. It's got cool features like smart docs. It knows what docs your client needs based on the app. It's got smart submission notes, pulls key data. It's got a tool called Lender Spotlight, which searches all the rates and guidelines. And now they even have a comparison tool, which is amazing. Check them out at lendesk.com/Finmo. All right, so let's talk about radio. So when I first got in the mortgage business, I actually did radio in my very first year, and it was quite the lesson. And I'll tell you about that story, and then the things that I've learned and how I would do it differently. And if I were doing radio today, what I would do. So first off, it was a radio show where I had a host. So this was a person who worked for the radio station, and I was the guest. And so they would ask me questions. I would give them questions to kind of like bat over the plate because they don't know your topic, and they just want something. It was a talk radio station, AM 1150, and I would have them on, and I had a weekly show that I would do, and I would also, what I found is that I don't always have because I was a new mortgage broker, didn't have tons of topics, I had to figure this stuff out and research it. I would bring guests on. And what I did was I measured over the course of a year the number of what I'd spent. And to get the radio show, the show was technically free. So they said, hey, you can do this for free, but in order to do it, you've actually got to, buy advertising. And so at the time it was $2,500 a month, which seemed like a lot. And at the end of the year, I'd spent $30,000, and I could directly tie deals from radio that were about $29,000, $30,000. It was almost break even. And I made the mistake of going, this is not worth it. I should quit. I should not have quit it. I could have adjusted what I was doing, and I would certainly learn what I've learned now from podcasting. I would have adjusted, but I would not have quit the radio program, because I've talked to other mortgage brokers who have been doing what they call traditional or terrestrial radio for a long time. And it's very powerful because of the time frame if you do it over a long enough time frame. So the biggest mistake I see people make, and they do this with podcasting as well, is they actually don't play a long enough game. It is not a get business today game. Like, it's just, you might, and cool if you do, but it is a long-term play. And if people keep hearing you over and over and over again, you become the de facto expert that they're going to talk to. They go, oh, I'm going to talk to that person. So that was the first mistake that I made. The second thing I did was because I had to do ads. I said, give me, and I would encourage you to do this, say, give me the time slots that these ads run. So give me a report on when the ads ran. And I saw we were running ads at 2 a.m, 3. I'm like, there's nobody flipping listening to my show at 2 or 3 a.m, or listening to these ads at 2 or 3 a.m, or very few. And so I actually paid a bit of a premium to get my ads run at 4:45. And it was like during rush hour when people were in their cars. And I also had I did less ads, but they were longer. So what I would do is I would do longer ads that broke up a pattern interrupt, and I would educate people and point them to the radio show that happened. And so it was an educational type thing, and that did work. Like, it drove traffic. So that's how, and I would probably do something similar if I were to do radio again today. And right now I don't do radio for mortgage brokers because podcasting works. So that was it. If you're going to do radio, it absolutely works. And the people that have been on it a long time will tell you that it puts money in their pocket, but you have to be willing to invest in it up front. So a couple other things. So we talked about, you got to do the ads. Think about when they're running the ads. That's important. Think about the creative for the ads. So one of the side effects or the benefits of the radio show that I did not realize until later, and I've leveraged into my podcast, is it really does give you a backstage pass to meet almost anybody. Like, I had some of the top economists in the country at the time. Like, I had Benjamin Tall on my show, who's a CIBC economist. I had a guy named, I can't remember his name, Yoshi Milosevic, and he was like a professor at a university in York who talked about interest rates. And I would get in, because I would just reach out to them and say, hey, I do a show on AM 1150. They don't know if there's 50,000 listeners or 50 listeners, but that that press pass got me in front of some amazing people. I had I think I had the wealthy barber guy in there too at one time. Like I had some amazing guests on there, and I did not leverage that anywhere near as well as I should have. So that would be the next thing that I would say is, so having the radio badge can allow you to get access to people and networks that you may not otherwise reach out. They may be like, I don't want to talk to you, your podcast. And if you start a podcast, like my podcast has been on for 10 years. And so it's in the mortgage, in a very narrow niche, I can get in front of almost anybody in the mortgage space. That doesn't translate into somebody outside the mortgage space, but with a radio badge, you can use that to get in front of people. The difference now is I would actually take that same content and I would I would say, I'll do this radio deal with you, but I'm allowed to have the content to share. And it can come out a week later. I don't care, but I'm allowed to have that content to share on social to drive traffic to the radio state show as well as to me personally. And then I would take the show. I would do two things. One, I would take the show and I would put it on Spotify and iTunes and all these places as a podcast. And I would say, this is my show. I would record a different intro and outro for it that I could actually, because on the radio, they usually do unless you have the free, like sometimes if you've been doing it a while, they'll give you your own mic and just let you go. And so what would happen is I would record a different intro and outro and I would say, hey, there's my show. The third thing I would do is I would take that show and I would take clips out of it. So I would actually take the most interesting clips, and whether it's interview style or whether it's you, and then I would share those. And then the other piece that I was able to do, because I was on AIM 1150, I was able to get on the CBC radio show. I leveraged that radio show to get onto other radio shows because they're like, oh, you can talk, you can communicate, you know what, you do that. So I'll have you on here. And so it allowed me to get into other networks. And so that's how if I was to do radio today, and if I was a mortgage broker in a market, if I was going to do it, I would commit for the long term. I would say you got to commit for at least, 2 or 3 years, and otherwise don't start. I use the example of, I live in a place, there's a lot of vineyards, probably 50 vineyards, within 50 kilometers of where I live, or 100 kilometers, and it's 60 miles from my American friends. And I think it's about 60 miles. And they tell me when you plant a vineyard, it takes like 3 years before there's like grapes, and 6 up to 7 years before you actually have a bottle of wine. And so they're playing the long game when you're planting a vineyard. You know that, hey, this could be worth it, but they don't go into it thinking, hey, they plant a vineyard and go, where's my bottle of wine? It's like, dude, it doesn't work that way. It's the same thing with this type of marketing. It can be effective if you can make it interesting. And so I would do that. I'll tell you other quick stories. When I did the radio show, we also did a call-in where people could call in and ask questions, which was kind of fun. But what would happen is that we would, there was no because this was very low budget. It was just me and the host. And so he had this little board on the thing. Say, if anybody has a question on mortgages, call us and we'll take your questions on the air. And we would, we didn't get tons of calls, but we would get some. And I remember one time, the phone board lit up, and I'm excited. I'm like, yeah, we get to talk to a listener, and the person calls like, hey, I'm just calling to report that there's an accident on this street. And I'm just like, they're not listening to the radio station at all. I'm just like, they don't care. They just want to talk. And so because we didn't have any screening process, they literally just dropped live into our show. It was just the most ridiculous thing. But anyway, knowing what I know now about the power of a podcast, I would have leveraged that radio station for a decade or more, 50, and it would have been powerful. And then you'd have all that clips, social clips, going into the radio station. Imagine you're sharing on your social, hey, just going in to record a show today, talking to X, Y, Z person, share that on your social ability. Like that stuff didn't exist back when I started in 2006. Well, it didn't exist like it does today. Certainly wouldn't have been easy to do. But knowing what I know now, I would absolutely take a radio show, if the math made sense. And then I would play a long game and leverage it into other content. I'd probably even consider throwing a camera up and recording myself video in the radio station. I'd get all this in the permission based from the radio station when I decided to sign the deal with them, so that I could actually use that stuff on YouTube and clips and stuff. And so that I would get the most possible content. So the other reason I stopped, the main reason I stopped was I was like, oh, I'm not making money. I'm breaking even. That was dumb. But it was also the time that it took me to prepare for these shows. And so I didn't, what I would do different now is I would actually create a framework, a format for the show. And I would run them probably, I've been doing podcasting for a long time, so I don't need much of a framework anymore. But when I started, I needed a framework, and I would have a framework for how the show goes. I'd have here's be this segment, and I would design it so that it was easier for me to actually deliver on a consistent basis. And so that's how I would do it. And I would probably have, recurring guests that I find interesting to come in and talk about things briefly and share their clips. I mean, with technology now, heck, you could record the clip in advance and just play it on the radio. So we used to have to get, when I had these economists and other people come on, they had to actually do it live. Now it'd be easy enough to just make that a recording and insert it into the show while you're delivering it. So do I think radio can work? Yes. If you understand the game that you're playing, and if you play long enough game with it, and you leverage the heck out of the badge that they give you, as well as the content that you create, you can actually use that everywhere. I would be using it everywhere. And you can leverage that one foothold in traditional radio, terrestrial radios, as my friends call it, who sell radio ads, and get in front of other radio stations and get on there and say, hey, I'm on this show. I'd be happy to come talk to you about what the rate cuts that just happened. And as long as you talk, and what the thing I tell you about radio, especially if you're being a guest, is they want you to talk in sound bites, really short, easy to understand. Don't get into long explanations and ramble like this. 10-minute would be way too long. They would want to ask a question. They'd want me to have some pithy response that gets them thinking, and then, go back and forth a little bit, and that's it. They don't want you to talk forever. So hopefully they find that useful. Thanks, Nav, for the question. And if you guys have something you want me to talk about, I'm happy to give you my 2 bits. This is just my 2 bits, of course. You may be like, Scott, that's crazy. I don't want to do it. Cool. You don't have to. I'm just sharing what my experience has been and how I would do different based on what I've learned. Thanks again for listening. And I hope you find this podcast useful. If you do me a favor, please go to Spotify, where you listen to this show, leave me a review. And I would really appreciate it. It helps when people find the show. And I love, the one thing I always say is there's no problem in your mortgage business that someone else hasn't already solved. Your problem is who's got the answer. So in this case, Nav is like, hey, what about radio? I'm like, oh, I can give you at least my thoughts on radio. And then you can hopefully, accelerate what your plan is and make fewer mistakes than I made. Hope you find that useful. My name is Scott Peckford. Thanks again for listening. And I will see you on the next episode.